Hello, my name is Tamás Kés.
Hi, I'm Weninger, and we both work at the National Institute of Education in Singapore.
First of all, we would like to thank you, Jarvis, for the opportunity to talk about our research paper on a semiotic analysis to language textbooks.
Let us give you some background to the paper. A couple of years ago, we were invited to present a paper as part of a conference panel on ideology in language textbook. We both had done research in this area and were interested in culture in language teaching and also in materials analysis. So we sat down with our little set of EFL textbooks to analyze them. And that's when we ran into trouble. Should we code and interpret texts and images from our own perspective? Or should we try to code them according to how Hungarian students might perceive them in the classroom? Clearly, there are generational and cultural gaps between us and present-day Hungarian teenagers, which would have an impact on interpretation. Therefore, we realized that we needed an analytic framework which would allow us to describe the potential meaning-making processes rather than offer fixed interpretations.
Another important consideration for us was the implications of textbook analysis for teaching culture in the foreign language classroom. There's a strong interest within applied linguistics in the impact of cultural and linguistic globalization, their effects on local languages, economies, and identities. For example, in the literature, people talk about transcultural flows in multiple Englishes, which have posed a challenge to EFL professionals and textbook writers, since target language and target culture are no longer clearly definable. In fact, it's no longer desirable or possible to foster target culture competence, and it seems that even intercultural competence may not be sufficient. Scholars, for example, Kumaravadivalu and Byram, have been calling for global cultural consciousness and intercultural citizenship as key outcomes of language learning.
And the shift in priorities and goals should also be reflected in language textbooks, right?
Absolutely. Textbooks can play a very important role in cultural learning, and there's a great deal of research on culture in English language textbooks. However, most of these studies are very critical of how culture is represented in the materials.
Indeed. The majority of these studies have taken the view of culture as representation. In terms of methodology, many studies employ a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods, where images and texts are coded as representing a particular culture. Their findings are very important because they show how dominant ideologies surface in the visual and textual content of textbooks. They also problematize the role of EFL as an instrument of political and cultural hegemony.
On the other hand, in textbook studies, culture is often taken to mean national culture, or thought of in terms of mutually exclusive categories such as Asian, Western, foreign, or non-foreign, downplaying the importance and existence of hybrid, subcultural, or even global cultural representations.
That's why we suggest that examining learning materials as carriers of cultural information alone is not enough. We agree with Crunch that cultural meaning is socially constructed by the interaction of the different perspectives of key participants in the learning process: students, teachers, and materials. Therefore, we feel that a more nuanced approach is needed that is able to analyze textbooks in terms of the meaning potential they engender through their textual and visual materials, as opposed to one that takes cultural content as fixed in textbooks.
So a focus on cultural meaning potential means that teachers can explore ideas learners generate through their engagement with the materials?
Yes, that's right. This is why we have outlined an approach that draws on basic notions of semiotic theory. By introducing semiotic principles in EFL textbook analysis, we focus on the formal dimensions of the meaning-making process, on how things can mean, and not so much on what things can mean. A semiotic approach can enable the analyst to describe the cultural meaning potential that task, text, and image generate together. We don't insist that such meanings will always be derived or that there would be one preferred interpretation. In other words, the approach treats meaning as emergent through learner engagement with the materials.
We draw on some key concepts developed by Charles Sanders Peirce. At the center of Peirce's theory is a triadic relationship that connects a sign, its object, i.e. what it represents, and an interpretant that the sign creates in the interpreter. In Peirce's own words, a sign is anything which is related to a second thing, its object, in respect to equality in such a way as to bring a third thing, its interpretant, into relation to the same object. Basically, anything can be a sign as long as these formal requirements are met. Furthermore, interpretants, that is, the meaning or mental image created in the interpreter's mind, must be seen as signs themselves that can trigger further processes of semiosis.
Yes, and this is why we consider the textbook activity as a complex sign, which should be the unit of examination. In this way, we want to account for the fact that very often the student's interpretation is quite heavily controlled through the tasks that are either presented in the materials or set by the teachers. So students who work with the materials are limited in making their own cultural meanings as they participate in what we call guided semiosis. That is a process which directs their attention to some, but not all the details of the materials, and also limits a chain of infinite associations that usually characterizes the meaning-making process outside of classrooms. For example, let's look at an extract from the textbook Engage by Oxford University Press. What would you think of if you first saw this image?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the movie 2012. Although I haven't seen it, I think of other similar movies I have seen which deal with similar catastrophes, for example, Dante's Peak. That's because I've heard of the movie 2012, and also the images suggest that there's something apocalyptic happening there. Then I see John Cusack, and I think of other movies I have seen in which he starred.
So basically, the meanings you create come out of an interaction of your previous experiences and knowledge and what the materials present. But let's see what the activity actually asks students to do.
Well, all three tasks that come with the text and the pictures focus on reading or listening skills. One asks the learners to scan for specific information, the other gets them to read for details, while the last one targets general comprehension and inferencing skills.
And there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Of course not. But take note that first of all, the students do not need to use the visuals to answer the questions. Second, the tasks focus on language skills and vocabulary, so there is no link to cultural learning there.
Yes, but yet other cultural analyses would probably categorize this extract as an example of American culture, maybe Hollywood, even though there's no follow-up task in the book that exploits the visuals or guides the learner's discussion towards such cultural issues. Therefore, cultural learning may happen, but it is entirely up to the teacher whether it happens or not. So meaning is not locked into the image itself. Just because Hollywood is represented, it doesn't mean that students will pay attention to it or notice its cultural significance, let alone have a meaningful discussion about it.
And this brings us to another point. We believe that the connection between textual and visual information in language textbooks very often denotational. That is, image and text serve the purpose of reinforcing referential or lexical meanings. This is what Peirce called an indexical relationship.
Yes, Peirce developed various typologies of signs, the most famous of which typify signs based upon their relation to their objects. So icons are related to their objects by similarity or likeness. So a photo or a map is an icon because it shares qualities with each object. An index represents its object through contiguity, which can be of three types. Causal, such as when tree branches are moving because of wind. Deictic, such as a pointing finger and the object that it's pointing to. Or labeling, such as a proper name indexing a person. Then signs are considered symbols if they represent objects by means of some conventional relation. So a red rose can become a symbol of love in some cultural contexts based on tradition and convention.
So in the previous example, we can say that the image and text are in an indexical relationship. Images point to words in the reading text. For example, words like earthquake or disaster are represented by the falling buildings. In the example, John Cusack is a mere visual equivalent to the lexical icon family and is not considered as an icon or a symbol that would stand for Hollywood. There's no doubt that denotational indexicality is good for language learning, but we should not forget that if this is the predominant sign type, then textbook users are encouraged to focus on linguistic forms, for example, grammar or vocabulary, at the expense of exploring cultural connotations.
Precisely. Moreover, if we take intercultural citizenship as a desired outcome of foreign language learning, then an almost exclusive focus on denotation will not get us very far. Images need to be much more than mere visual reinforcement or space fillers. They need to be utilized as icons or symbols of things in their own right, as the explicit focus of attention in a meaningful pedagogic task, as entry points for critical discussions about students' cultural beliefs and stereotypes, complemented by task and text that foster awareness and criticality.
All right, to sum up, a semiotic approach will not show us what meanings must be definitely attributed to a verb. It will not provide or even discover such meanings. It will, however, describe the logic according to which meanings are created. And it is this focus on the formal dimensions of meaning-making process, on how things can mean, that makes this approach different from other interpretative approaches. In other words, we propose to investigate the semiotic potential in particular constellations of text and image-generating foreign language textbooks without the need to identify any one potential meaning as primary. So when it comes to cultural meaning, it is also important to consider the starting point of the semiosis, what we call the cultural and lexical origo. This is the reference point in relation to which learners create cultural interpretations. This origo can be the student as a cultural being, influenced by the broader cultural context in which they live, or the context of the teaching material itself.
So what does this mean to the language teacher? While other textbook analyses may categorize images or text as representing certain cultures or ideologies, our approach focuses on possible meanings that the textbook encourages through the use of a pedagogical task. We should not forget that textbooks are not only cultural, but also pedagogical artifacts, something other analyses tend to overlook. Since cultural meaning is not considered to be logged into the materials, our approach gives teachers more agency in exploiting materials or creating tasks that facilitate cultural reflexivity. By discovering the semiotic processes the materials encourage and taking into account the cultural and lexical origo of their students and of themselves, teachers are in a position to create a cultural learning experience that can develop new cultural understandings.
Well, this is only a very brief overview of the arguments we presented in the paper. However, we hope that it has intrigued you to go and read the full article. We also hope that you will share your ideas and thoughts with us in the comment sections of this video.
Thank you for watching, and goodbye.
Goodbye.